Hello, I'm John Feldt, and this is the weekly water outlook for June 16th. Well, as I said, as we get into the summer months, the precipitation patterns are going to be more driven by the mesoscale. This is a smaller scale, much more harder to forecast this type of precipitation, both the amounts of rain as well as where it's going to form. Good example are these two events that occurred over the last week. We have the one on the top left around Atlanta, a very small area of thunderstorms that produced a lot of rain. And then we had very much a mesoscale, or cluster of very large thunderstorms over parts of the upper Midwest that developed. And that cluster developed and moved all the way across the middle part of the nation into the mid-Atlantic and even the East Coast over the period of 24 hours. So these are much harder to forecast as we get into summer months, much more than a couple hours in advance. Now, last week was sort of a challenging forecast for Texas. I mentioned that the ridge of high pressure would bow to the north, and that would pretty much shut off precipitation. And generally, it did not happen. I'll show you in a minute that Texas was sort of in a weak spot between that high, and it never really built as strong as the models were forecasting. So there was some very welcome rain over parts of the state. You can see that green was anywhere from a ½ inch to 2 inches of rain, primarily around a ½ inch to an inch. Very heavy rain down in parts of South Texas. The yellow is 2 inches and even as much as 10 inches in a very isolated area, that area in purple. Eastern Oklahoma received less amount of rain, very little rain in eastern Oklahoma, and keep in mind that's been very wet, so it's sort of welcome that that area right here dried out. But pretty much all this rain was welcome, and even in the far west part of the state, not as much, a ½ inch or less, anywhere from a tenth to a ½ inch, but that was very welcome in that region as well. So even with that ridge building up over the state, you can see almost the entire state of Texas did receive some precipitation over the last 7 days. Now these are the areas that had either a surplus or deficit. It very clearly shows over eastern Oklahoma the deficit, and that is about an inch or two of deficit of rainfall, and it's been much more above normal over the last month or so, actually since winter. So that area has needed to be some drying, and it did occur over the last week. If we looked over the rest of the state of Texas, even though the rain was here and there, it basically fell in the normal range for the month or for the week. In fact, the eastern part of the Texas was dry. And then if we get in the far south Texas, you can see that area of heavier rain, and that was plus 3 or 4 inches surplus for the week. Okay, here's the drought monitor. You can see that there's very abrupt changes from east to west. West Texas and western Oklahoma remain in an extreme or an exceptional drought. And then as we get into the eastern part of Oklahoma, the drought evaporates. Arkansas, no drought, and just mainly lighter amounts of drought over the eastern part of Texas, and then expanding to more severe drought in the west and the south. If you look at changes over both the 1 week and 4 week on the bottom, let's take a look at the 4 week first. If you look at the 4 week, you can see that there was some improvement. Green indicates improving conditions or classifications of drought. Yellow is deteriorating. So you can see most of the region deteriorated over the last 4 weeks, with the exception of Oklahoma, eastern Oklahoma. That's that area of green. So there was some improvement in that region. Now, if we look at just the last week, and there's a delay in here. This goes through June 11th. You can see in the short term, the trend has generally been deterioration over most areas, with the exception of eastern Oklahoma. That sort of held its own. So let's look at the steering winds, and I want to explain why it didn't quite work out last week. Well, here's your ridge of high pressure, and there's definitely was some bulging of the ridge, but it really wasn't as strong as the models were forecast. This jet stream's still quite strong, but I really think what occurred here is, if you look at here, here's this weakness right over Oklahoma and Texas. To the west, strong ridging, and to the right, strong ridging. But right in the middle, there's this area of weakness, and an area of upper low pressure developed right in here. I sent a blog out on that earlier this week, and that allowed some moisture to stream in here and produce that welcome, if not unexpected, rain over the last week. But the core of jet energy is definitely well to our north. That would be normal this time of year, and is forecast to remain to the north into the foreseeable future. Well, here's the jet stream this week. It's not a whole lot different than last week. It looks like we're in a very stable pattern. Jet streams normally north of our area this time of year. So precipitation that forms over the area is generally going to be that smaller scale that's going to be a little bit more difficult to forecast. This is a 6 to 10 day jet stream. Now I do want to point out that this isn't a real strong ridge pattern, so the precipitation very well could drop down into the region, especially Kentucky or Kansas and Oklahoma, North Texas from time to time. That is a possibility. This isn't one of those highs that just totally cuts off precipitation. So here's the forecast. I wanted to show the very strong dry trend over the western U.S., and that looks like it's going to generally remain in place over the central and southern parts of Texas. But like I said, the further north you go into Oklahoma, there will be some scattered precipitation, and it could be significant over eastern parts of Oklahoma into Arkansas. Now, this is the forecast that goes into week 1 on the top and week 2. Take a look at week 2. Don't get too hung up on the actual amounts, but these are the trends. And this is what I would call a normal type pattern for this type of year, probably scattered in that 30 to 40% probability over the eastern parts of Texas and Oklahoma, and then drier over the western parts, and then that strong dry signal from West Texas out into the southwest U.S. So here are your takeaway points. Texas mainly dry this week. I'm not going to rule out some scattered precipitation. Further up to the north, Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas, better chance of rain, but I still think it's going to be in the scattered category. And not much change in this overall pattern through the rest of the month. I wish you all a happy Father's Day, and I will be talking with you again next weekend.